In today's video, I want to tell you a story that may make you uncomfortable, not because it's filled with shocking twists or dramatic confrontations, but because it explores something far more dangerous, something that often grows in silence. It's a story about loneliness, temptation, and the small decisions that slowly lead people toward places they never imagined they would go. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy stories that explore the complicated side of human nature. This channel is about the truths people rarely talk about openly, the quiet struggles, the hidden regrets, the moments that can change an entire life. And if you've ever felt trapped between responsibility and desire, between who you are and who you wish you could be, then this story might stay with you long after it ends. I used to believe betrayal was something that happened to other people. Whenever I heard stories about affairs or broken marriages, I would shake my head and wonder how someone could risk everything they had built. I wasn't naive. I knew relationships were difficult. I knew people made mistakes. But I genuinely believed that some lines were too important to cross. I thought I understood the cost. I thought knowing the consequences would be enough to keep me safe. I was wrong. At 39 years old, my life looked successful from the outside. I had been married for nearly 17 years. We lived in a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood. We had 2 children who were healthy, intelligent, and mostly happy. Our bills were paid on time. We took family photos every Christmas. We celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and holidays. If someone had looked at my life from a distance, they would have called it stable, maybe even ideal. But there is a difference between looking happy and feeling alive. That difference became larger every year. My husband wasn't a bad man. That's important to understand. This isn't one of those stories where a cruel husband drives his wife into someone else's arms. It would almost be easier if it were. He was hardworking, reliable, responsible, the kind of man who always shows up when it mattered. The problem wasn't that he stopped loving me. The problem was that somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. In the beginning, things were different. We used to stay awake until 2 in the morning, talking about everything and nothing. We would drive with no destination just because we enjoyed being together. He used to reach for my hand without thinking. Used to kiss my forehead when he walked past me in the kitchen. Used to ask questions and actually wait for the answers. Those little things don't seem important when you have them, but you notice their absence when they're gone. Over time, work became his primary focus. Again, I understood why. He wanted to provide for us. He wanted security. He wanted our children to have opportunities neither of us had growing up. For years, I admired that dedication. I defended it. When friends complained about absent husbands, I would tell them mine was working for our future. And technically, that was true. But eventually, the future arrived. And somehow, we still weren't living in the present. The conversations became shorter. The laughter became less frequent. The affection slowly disappeared. Not because of anger. Not because of hatred. Simply because routine took its place. Our marriage didn't collapse. It faded. Night after night, we sat in the same room doing different things. He watched television. I scrolled through my phone. Sometimes hours would pass without either of us saying anything meaningful. And the strangest part was how normal it became. Humans can adapt to almost anything, even loneliness. Especially loneliness. I convinced myself that this was adulthood. This was maturity. This was what long-term relationships looked like. Passion was for younger couples. Excitement was temporary. Connection naturally faded. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, another voice whispered a different truth. A truth I didn't want to hear. I wasn't just bored. I was lonely. And loneliness has a way of creating empty spaces inside people. Empty spaces that quietly wait to be filled. Every morning I followed the same routine. Wake up, make breakfast, get the kids ready, answer emails, run errands, clean the house, prepare dinner, repeat. There is dignity in responsibility. I believe that. But there is also danger in losing yourself completely inside obligations. Somewhere between being a wife, a mother, and a caretaker of everyone else's needs, I stopped recognizing the woman I used to be. The woman with dreams. The woman with energy. The woman who felt interesting. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone dependable. Someone practical. Someone useful. But I no longer saw someone desirable, or vibrant, or alive. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough to begin shifting the direction of my life. A friend of ours mentioned that her son was looking for temporary work while he figured out his next steps. He was 26, hardworking, polite, needed a short-term job. At the time, we needed help reorganizing and renovating our garage. My husband thought it was a good idea. I agreed without much thought. If someone had told me then how significant that decision would become, I would have laughed. The first time I met him, there was nothing remarkable about the encounter. He introduced himself, shook my hand, smiled politely, then got to work. That was it. No sparks, no instant attraction, nothing dramatic. And maybe that's why I never saw the danger coming. Because temptation rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with warning signs. It doesn't knock on your door and introduce itself. It sneaks into ordinary moments. The first few weeks passed normally. He worked in the garage while I handled things inside the house. Occasionally we exchanged brief conversations. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate. Then small things started happening, tiny things. The kind of things most people wouldn't notice. One afternoon he asked how my day was going. Not unusual. Except he actually listened. When I answered, he paid attention. He didn't glance at his phone. He didn't look distracted. He listened. That shouldn't have mattered. But it did. Another day, he noticed I looked tired. "You should take a break," he said. "You look exhausted." I laughed and brushed it off. But later that night I realized something uncomfortable. No one had noticed I was tired in a very long time. Not because they didn't care. Because everyone assumed I was fine. I was always fine. The dependable one, the organized one, the strong one. People stop checking on strong people. They assume strength means immunity. It doesn't. Week after week, our conversations became slightly longer. Still harmless. Still innocent. At least that's what I told myself. We talked about books, movies, family, life goals, the future. Sometimes he would ask questions that forced me to think about myself in ways I hadn't for years. Questions no one else asked anymore. Questions my husband used to ask when we were younger. What makes you happy? What would you do if money wasn't a concern? What's something you've always wanted to try? Simple questions. But they reminded me of a version of myself I had forgotten, and slowly that became addictive. Not him, the feeling of being seen, of being noticed, of being remembered. One evening, I caught myself looking forward to hearing his voice. The realization frightened me. I immediately tried to push it away. This is ridiculous, I thought. You're imagining things. You're lonely. That's all. But denial doesn't eliminate emotions. It only delays dealing with them. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. I thought about him more often than I should. Not constantly, not obsessively, just enough to make me uncomfortable. And deep down, I knew why. Because for the first time in years, someone made me feel visible. One afternoon, I walked into the garage to drop off bottled water. He thanked me and smiled. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate. Yet when our eyes met, something lingered. A second too long, maybe two. And in that brief moment, a warning alarm sounded somewhere inside me. I should have listened. I should have stepped back, created distance, set boundaries, done something. Instead, I convinced myself I was overreacting. After all, nothing had happened, at least not yet. But sometimes the most important lines are crossed long before any physical action occurs. Sometimes they are crossed inside the mind, inside the heart, inside the private places where rationalizations begin. And without realizing it, I was already standing closer to that line than I wanted to admit. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen. The house was silent. The clock ticked softly on the wall. My husband had fallen asleep on the couch. The children were in their rooms. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a dangerous question. When was the last time I truly felt alive? I couldn't answer. That scared me more than anything, because it meant I had been surviving instead of living, existing instead of connecting. And somewhere deep inside, a hunger was growing. A hunger not for excitement, not for adventure, but for connection, for understanding, for recognition. The problem was that hunger doesn't always lead people toward healthy solutions. Sometimes it leads them toward the very thing that can destroy everything they love. And although I didn't know it yet, I was already walking toward a crossroads that would force me to confront the worst parts of myself. A crossroads where one choice would preserve everything I had built, and another choice would threaten to unravel it all. What I didn't understand then was that the most dangerous decisions rarely feel dangerous in the beginning. They feel comforting, exciting, validating, necessary. And that's exactly what made what happened next so difficult to resist. We continue a story that isn't really about betrayal, at least, not entirely. It's about loneliness. It's about the dangerous places silence can create inside a marriage. It's about the moment someone realizes they have become a stranger to themselves. And most of all, it's about consequences, the kind that don't arrive all at once, but slowly, quietly, until they reshape everything. When we left off, I was standing at a crossroads. Nothing physical had happened. No boundaries had technically been crossed. But if I'm honest, something had already changed. Because emotional distance doesn't begin with actions. It begins with attention, with thoughts, with anticipation, with looking forward to seeing someone more than you should. And once that starts, the real battle isn't between two people. It's between the person you are and the person you're becoming. The following weeks felt different, not on the surface. Life continued as usual. I still made breakfast every morning. I still packed lunches. I still drove my children where they needed to go. I still smiled when neighbors waved. From the outside, nothing looked unusual, but inside me a storm was quietly gathering. I started noticing how often I thought about him. A conversation would replay in my mind while I folded laundry. A smile would appear in my memory while I washed dishes. Sometimes I would catch myself looking toward the garage window, wondering if he was there. Every time it happened, guilt followed, immediate, sharp, uncomfortable. I knew these thoughts were dangerous. I knew they were unfair to my husband. And yet knowing something is wrong doesn't automatically stop it. That's one of the hardest truths people learn about temptation. Knowledge and behavior are not always connected. You can understand a cliff is dangerous and still walk toward the edge. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the backyard while he worked nearby. The weather was warm. The sky was clear. Nothing remarkable about the day. And yet I remember every detail. Because sometimes life changes during moments that appear completely ordinary. We talked at first about simple things. Work, family, plans. Then the conversation shifted. He asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was inappropriate. Because nobody had asked me that in years. People asked if I was busy. People asked if I was tired. People asked if everything was okay. But happiness? No. Nobody asked about happiness anymore. For several seconds, I couldn't answer. And that silence said more than words ever could. He noticed. Of course he noticed. You don't have to answer, he said quietly. But the truth was already visible. The truth was that I didn't know. I honestly didn't know if I was happy, and realizing that terrified me. That night, after everyone was asleep, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. I looked at my reflection longer than usual. The woman staring back looked familiar, yet somehow distant. When had life become so predictable? When had I stopped feeling excited about anything? When had I started measuring my days by responsibilities instead of experiences? The questions came one after another, and each answer left me feeling emptier. What I didn't realize was that I was asking the wrong questions. I wasn't unhappy because of my husband. I wasn't unhappy because of my family. I was unhappy because I had slowly abandoned parts of myself. But instead of addressing that truth, I was allowing another person to become the symbol of everything I felt was missing. And that is where many people make their biggest mistake. They confuse a person with a solution. They mistake attention for healing. They mistake excitement for fulfillment. The next significant moment happened on a rainy afternoon. The kind of afternoon where clouds turn the entire world gray. The house felt unusually quiet. The children were away. My husband was working late. I was alone in the kitchen when I heard the back door open. Even before I turned around, I knew who it was. And the fact that I knew immediately should have frightened me more than it did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain tapped softly against the windows. The silence stretched between us. Neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. Just heavy. Filled with things neither of us wanted to say aloud. Finally, he spoke. We need to stop pretending. My heart immediately began racing. Because I knew exactly what he meant. And because part of me had been waiting to hear those words. I should have ended the conversation right there. I should have walked away. I should have protected my marriage, my family. Instead, I stood there, listening. And sometimes standing still is all it takes to move in the wrong direction. For several minutes, we talked honestly. Maybe more honestly than we should have. About loneliness. About feeling unseen. About wanting more from life. None of it justified what was happening, but it explained why it felt so powerful. People often think temptation is about desire. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's about recognition. About someone looking at you and seeing parts of yourself that you've forgotten. That doesn't make it right. It simply makes it human. When he finally left that day, nothing dramatic had occurred. No declarations, no promises, no plans. And yet everything felt different. Because the emotional boundary had been crossed completely. After that, guilt became my constant companion. I carried it everywhere. While cooking, while driving, while sitting beside my husband. Especially while sitting beside my husband. Because suddenly, I noticed all the things I had stopped appreciating. The way he always locked the doors before bed. The way he checked on the children every night. The way he remembered practical details nobody else noticed. The truth was painful. He wasn't a bad husband. He was simply human, busy, tired, imperfect, just like me. And realizing that made my choices harder to excuse. Days passed, then another week. The emotional tension became exhausting. Part of me wanted distance. Part of me wanted more. I felt trapped between two versions of my future. One built on responsibility. The other built on impulse. One familiar. The other uncertain. One stable. The other emotionally intoxicating. And the frightening thing about temptation is that uncertainty often feels more exciting than stability. That's why people risk things they should never risk. Not because they're evil, because they convince themselves they're pursuing happiness. One evening, my daughter walked into the kitchen holding a small piece of paper. My stomach dropped instantly. Before she even spoke, I knew. She had found one of the notes, a note that never should have existed. Her expression was innocent, curious, confused. "Mom, what is this?" The question seemed simple, but it felt like standing beneath a spotlight. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Every terrible possibility rushed through my mind. I took the paper from her hand, read the familiar words, and felt shame wash over me. "It's nothing important," I said, too quickly, too defensively. She studied my face. Children are far more perceptive than adults realize. They may not understand situations, but they understand emotions. And in that moment, she sensed something. I could see it. She didn't argue, didn't ask more questions. She simply nodded and walked away. But the look in her eyes stayed with me, because for the first time, I understood something clearly. My choices were no longer affecting only me. The consequences were already spreading. Even before the truth came out, even before anyone knew the full story, the damage had begun. That realization should have been enough. It should have ended everything. But change is rarely that simple. A few days later, something happened that forced me to confront reality. I heard voices near the front door. One voice belonged to my husband. The other belonged to him. I froze immediately. My pulse hammered against my chest. Slowly I moved closer. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to hear. Their conversation was calm, respectful, controlled, which somehow made it worse. Then I heard my husband say something I will never forget. "Thank you for your help, but I think it's best if we end things here. No anger, accusation, no confrontation, just finality. The kind of finality that leaves no room for discussion." For a brief second, our eyes met. And in that moment, everything became clear. Not because words were exchanged, because none were necessary. The chapter was over, and suddenly I realized how exhausted I was. Exhausted from hiding, exhausted from rationalizing, exhausted from carrying secrets. When the door closed, an unexpected feeling settled over me. Not relief, not heartbreak, something else, clarity. For months, I had convinced myself that another person represented the answer to my unhappiness. But standing there, watching that chapter end, I understood something important. The problem had never been another person. The problem was everything I refused to confront inside my own life. My silence, my resentment, my loneliness, my lack of communication, my unwillingness to admit that parts of my marriage needed attention. No outside relationship could fix those things, because they existed inside me. Weeks passed. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as possible. My husband never confronted me directly, never asked questions, never demanded explanations. But something had changed. Trust is strange. When it's strong, you barely notice it. When it's damaged, you notice it every day. Conversations felt different. Silences felt heavier. Distance felt more noticeable. Sometimes I wondered if he knew. Sometimes I wondered if he simply sensed enough to stop asking questions. To this day, I don't know. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of the consequence. Not every mistake ends with a dramatic confession. Sometimes it ends with quiet distance. Sometimes it ends with wondering. Sometimes it ends with living alongside the shadow of what almost happened. Late at night, after everyone was asleep, I often sat alone in the living room thinking about everything. The choices, the warning signs, the moments when I could have turned back. Because looking back, there wasn't one decision that changed everything. There were dozens, tiny decisions, small permissions, little rationalizations, the kind that seem harmless until they're not. That's the truth most people don't understand. Life rarely changes because of one enormous mistake. It changes because of many small ones. And if this experience taught me anything, it's this. Loneliness grows in silence. Relationships weaken in silence. Resentment grows in silence. and silence can become more dangerous than conflict itself. If you're struggling in your marriage, talk. If you feel unseen, talk. If you feel disconnected, talk. Because the conversations you're avoiding today may become the problems you face tomorrow. The attention we crave from others often points toward needs we haven't addressed within ourselves. And if we aren't careful, we start searching for solutions in the wrong places. Years later, when I think about that chapter of my life, I don't remember excitement. I don't remember butterflies. I don't remember intensity. What I remember most clearly is the lesson, the realization that feeling alive and living wisely are not always the same thing. Sometimes the things that make us feel most alive in the moment leave the deepest scars afterward. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't chase a new beginning. It's repair what already exists. It's face uncomfortable truths. It's have difficult conversations. It's rebuild connection where silence has taken root. Most of all, it's taking responsibility. Not blaming loneliness, not blaming circumstances, not blaming another person. Taking responsibility. Because at the end of the day, circumstances create opportunities, but choices create consequences. And every consequence eventually asks the same question: who do you want to become? That question changed my life. Maybe one day it will change yours too. Thank you for listening to this story. If it made you think about relationships, choices, and the hidden struggles people carry, don't forget to subscribe. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the quiet ones. And sometimes hearing someone else's story helps us avoid making the same mistakes ourselves.